I will start the talk with the fact that I do have some good news and some bad news, and I will disappoint you later, not at the beginning. So for now, we're going to talk about fun stuff, but the same disappointment that I'm suffering as a result of this, I guess, research agenda you guys will get to share in a little bit. So the good news, evolution is intelligent, and those of you that are familiar with self-organization have probably heard this statement before. Underneath that statement, you see actually a painting of Alex Gray, who's actually trying to depict this one way or another. And those of you that are familiar with his art know that he's really, really trying to get at some of the more deeper aspects of what you and I are talking about today. And so the statement that evolution is intelligent is, you see that there's a little asterisk there, because if I ask many of you here what constitutes intelligence, you're going to give me a different answer. Same for consciousness, right? Which is why it's a really big. Really important to actually define a lot of these things at times. Now, the motivation for this talk was actually coming from intelligent design / creationist arguments for what exists today. Now, I'm not a creationist or intelligent design person. However, I do share the opinion with them that the degree to which, I guess, nature, biology, physics, etc., is specialized for, I guess, succeeding on this planet seems to be rather interesting. I mean, we are very, very effective creatures at our metabolism is fairly efficient. When you look at, I guess, at least plants, the metabolism that goes on as a result of chlorophyll goes way beyond anything human beings have created. So how did this happen, right? And the motivation for the intelligent design argument is the famous watchmaker argument, that if you're walking around in an empty field, you kick something, you pick it up, it looks like a pocket watch, well, then you must automatically assume that it wasn't a natural product because it's complex and designed, so there must be a designer. This is the teleological argument for the existence of God. One of the famous ones that's been completely blown to pieces, because how do you actually define intelligence? Something that looks intelligent to us may not be intelligent to some other people, right? So if, in fact, you don't have a definition of intelligence, then you can't really say that there must have been a designer involved in the process. And that, I'm completely on board with that, right? However, it does seem that things in the natural world are uncannily specified to take advantages of all the different aspects of our energy arrays, various other electromagnetic interactions. For example, like this sunflower. When you look at the packing of sunflower seeds inside the sunflower, it is the most energy efficient packing for seeds, right? So how did that actually happen? How did the sunflower figure out that I have to arrange my seeds in these particular fractal arrangements such that I get maximum sun, maximum future reproduction, and more beautiful sunflowers for us all to look at? And so the process which is involved in this particular arrangement is called self-organization. It is very present in the physical world as well as the biological world. So I'll just define it really briefly at first. Self-organization is the process where a structure or pattern appears in a system without a central authority or external element imposing it through a predetermined physical interaction or planning. This is exactly what's happening with Larissa's neurons. They were self-organizing. There wasn't a brain-imposing organization, and in fact, in the sunflower, there isn't somebody saying, arrange these seeds like this, right? And so the neat thing about these patterns that emerge is that the globally coherent pattern appears from the local interactions of the elements that make up the system, so the organization is achieved both in parallel and distributed fashion. So it's one of these interesting processes. And the first person to really talk about self-organization was Immanuel Kant, right? And he actually defined a self-organizing system as a system that is at the same time the means and the ends to what's going on. So that's self-organization. You have a bunch of low-level interactions, and I'll give you guys a number of examples, that are producing phenomena that are not previously predicted by these low-level aspects of these systems. So if you were to take the system brand new, you had never seen it, add some energy to it, once the system reaches the energy level which is just at the edge of chaos, which is called pink noise, and I'll get to that in a second, it self-organizes and produces behavior that is not previously predicted if you have never observed it before. So it's something that looks pretty amazing, especially the first time you observe it. Now, self-organization is evident in a lot of things, but something that you may have had experience with are roll cells. And so on the left-hand side, those are actually roll cells of very, very cooled lithium, which most of you have probably not seen. But on the right-hand side are roll cells of olive oil. And so when you put a thin layer of olive oil in a pan and start heating it up, what actually happens is an image sort of like on the left-hand side of the screen. When enough energy is added, there are these vertical roll cells that are created where the heat exchange between the bottom of the oil and the top of the oil is operating at a maximum, most efficient process, right? So at some point, this system self-organized into something that's very, very pretty and that is actually exchanging heat optimally. And so this was not predicted by any properties of oil, any properties of the pan that it was on. It was only observed once you added this critical amount of energy. And so in fact, besides the roll cells that you see commonly when you're cooking, at various different, I guess, symmetry breaking scenarios or specific points of energy addition to the system, they create new interesting heat exchange patterns. So it's not just these little cells, it's in fact many, many different ones. And so in the inanimate world, there are literally hundreds of examples of physics, of self-organization happening in physics. And in fact, if you check out the Scholarpedia entry on self-organization, you will see that I mostly pulled most of these from there. So things like the formation of spatial temporal patterns. Most of you have seen a laser. In fact, we're using one right now, right? So a laser pointer. One thing that a laser does is it enslaves the light particles that are around it. It focuses them into a beam. That is a self-organizing phenomenon, actually. And so that process is the result of these higher order correlations happening within the beam. And so some other examples include fluid dynamics, gas discharge patterns, things in plasma physics, semiconductors, formation of galaxies in terms of astrophysics, climatology, cloud formations, meteorology, coastal formation, geophysics, I guess a number of things, self-sustaining oscillators, which I actually am very, very interested in. In chemistry, those of you that are chemists, the Briggs-Rauscher reaction, chemical reactions leading to dissipative structures, all those things show self-organizing properties. And so in the, I guess, animate world, we also have a number of examples of this too. And so this is really the part that interests me, because on a physical scale, self-organization very much makes sense as a sort of phenomenon that happens as a result of physical interactions between molecules. In the animate world, it starts to become more interesting because it implies a few things about what's going on. So since self-organizing systems are operating at sort of an optimal capacity, it very much suggests the sort of the intelligence of these processes. Now, I'm not saying that someone somewhere created these things, but if you were to create a biological system like our cell and you wanted to make it optimally efficient at producing various chemicals from its, I guess, from its internal organelles, then you would create something that looks very much like our cell. What a lot of people don't talk about is that when you inherit your DNA from your parents, you're not just inheriting DNA, you're inheriting the entire cell and the entire cell's mechanisms. And so that's not in the DNA, in fact, right? So the DNA itself is, in fact, the software that runs the hardware, which is the cell. And the cell itself is completely self-organized. It actually keeps critical amounts of various chemicals within its cell walls, or I guess inside the cell walls. And when it needs to produce those chemicals, all it needs to do is produce little seeds. Most of you have experienced rain, right? So some of us that live in the New Mexico desert haven't seen it for about 120 days, but the way rain forms actually in rain clouds is that rain clouds are super saturated, right? So when you wonder, they're floating around, they're super saturated with water. What makes the rain actually go? Is it one raindrop? Is it two? Is it sort of a cascade that happens? Well, in reality, rain clouds are fractal. And so when we get to fractals, all you need is a couple of seeds, and that self-organizing process just turns the entire thing on, and it's raining. So that's again, a physical example. So in the animate world, we have morphogenesis, growth of plants and animals, particularly trees. It's very evident that they're self-organized. Cell operation, growth of brains, and in fact, when you look at the self-organization of neural structure, it's one of the best evidences in the biological world, especially relevant to humans. Population dynamics, growth and competition and extinction. In epidemiology, you see it in the spread of diseases. In ecology, you see it in the survival and existence of serious niches and ecosystems. And the, I guess, part that interests me the most is the self-organization present in evolution. So when you look at mutation, selection, and particularly prebiotic evolution, you can see self-organization happening. When you actually look at the, the Eigen-Schuster hypercycle, which created the first amino acids that became our cells, et cetera, that process is the result of self-organization of molecules. And so if self-organization is in fact a mechanism of evolution, it would imply that evolution is somehow working in a semi-optimal or near-optimal level, and I'm just going to call that intelligent for now. Now, I'm not the first person at all to say this, right? The first person to really say it out loud and say it proud was Kaufman in 1993, who wrote a great book called The Origin of Order, Self-Organization, and Selection in Evolution. He identified self-organization as a prominent evolutionary mechanism and actually gives you hundreds of great examples of where this applies. However, the average evolutionary scientist, the average genetic person that studies the transmission of genes, populations, et cetera, generally ignores molecular biology and particularly self-organization. So even though Kaufman made a big deal about it in 1993, and several other biologists and geneticists have come out in support of self-organization as a main driving process in evolution, it's generally being ignored. Now, there's a recent paper that came out by Johnson and Lamb where they really looked at the interaction between self-organization and natural selection, and I think they have it right in many ways. They state that self-organization constrains the possible solutions that biology can come up with. So, in fact, if we're designed to be sort of semi-optimal organisms, then clearly natural selection is involved in survival of the fittest, right? And I tell my intro psych students it's survival of the most successfully horny, actually. And so, realistically, natural selection is very much in play, but self-organization constrains the possible solutions that are available for the various possible, organelles, organs, and other things that are true to biological creatures. So my goal is to really show the rest of the genetic scientists who are ignoring this stuff that there is really a fingerprint of self-organization even at the level of natural selection. So when we look at fingerprints, I guess the fingerprint for, in this particular instance, would be the occurrence of mutations. The assumption is that mutations are in fact random. But if those mutations are not random but structured, then the occurrence of mutations are self-organized, right? Structured in a particular way. And so I will explain what kind of structure it needs. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the term white noise. It's the static you hear on the radio when you're not tuned to anything, or on television if it's not tuned to a station. There are different colors of noise, as it turns out, and those colors define statistical aspects of that noise. And so pink noise is a fingerprint of self-organization. So if we see the presence of noise that's structured in a pink matter and has a fractal dimension of 1 to 1.5, then in fact you can say that a biological system is in fact self-organized. This is very evident in heart rates, actually. So for all of you in the audience who have a healthy heart, as it turns out, your heart is not very, very steady. It has a specific fluctuation, which is in the pink noise region. It actually has a fractal dimension of nearly 1, so it's almost a perfect example of pink noise on a biological system. Now, self-similarity is something that you're all familiar with, but probably just in the context of the Mandelbrot set. So the Mandelbrot set, things that exist on a smaller level also exist on a larger level. Well, the same thing is true for pink noise. It's the exact same concept. So what's going on in this signal, and this is, let's say, a signal of the occurrence of mutations in our context, is that smaller parts of the signal, as you keep cutting it down, look like the larger parts. Now, they're not exact copies like in a Mandelbrot, but if you were to do a statistical analysis, you would see that the distributions are pretty much the same. So when you actually look at noise, you can calculate a spectral slope and fractal dimension, which are basically interrelated by a mathematical formula. Here's the different ranges of noises that exist. So white noise is what we're all familiar with. Pink noise is the area that is involved in self-organization that we're most interested in. These are Brownian motion noise, a different kind of randomness, and this is blue noise, which is anti-correlated noise. That means negative observations follow positive observations. And so when we actually measure the fractal dimension of something, we can do that to a signal, and a signal of mutations particularly. And so the analogy is when you're measuring a coastline, you can do it with a ruler that's 50 meters or let's say 100 meters, you'd get different answers. That's exactly what we do when we actually are looking at the fractal dimension of a signal. So we actually just look at the signal, bin it up in different dimensions, and then look at the standard deviations. If those standard deviations are not all related, it's white noise, it's random. If those standard deviations have a pattern, if certain groups grouped together make differences that are relevant, then in fact, then the noise is pink. So my proposed experiment here is just to do a dispersion analysis, a fractal dimension computation, on the variable of mutations. So if in fact the gaps between mutations are not random, if they're pink, then evolution and mutations are self-organized and are structured. The problem is, and here's the bad news, and I'm disappointing you like 1 minute over my talk, is that not a single geneticist out there that I've contacted wants to do this research. The reason being is that it's really, really expensive. In order to actually do this research, you need to keep track of the genotypes of successive mutations. Now, you could do this with viruses and bacteria on a small scale, but you can't do it every single time. Most people that do genetic research are keeping track of phenotypes, not genotypes. So in fact, we do have rapid DNA fingerprinting techniques, but they are extremely expensive. So until it gets fairly inexpensive, I'm sort of stuck. And I'm just stuck talking to people like you, which is kind of great. If there are any geneticists in the audience, please come talk to me to see if we can get this done. So hopefully this is a temporary problem. And sort of the real impetus is to try to show that evolution is not this just like sort of blind process that's sort of running into walls as it's going along. What's going on is that evolution is designing creatures, designing, that's a bad way to say, producing creatures that are in many ways optimally designed for survival on this planet, at least in the local time frame. So in summary, self-organization and natural selection are both key processes in evolution, and although there's ample evidence that self-organization is being ignored by evolutionary scientists, so hopefully we can find a fingerprint of self-organization by employing a dispersion analysis for a record of mutations, and this should actually prove the point finally. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for a couple questions.
You know, if we don't know that computer is full of programs, it could seem to be very self-organized system.
Sure, in theory. Yeah.
So how do you know that there are no programs recorded somewhere in more subtle world which programs these creatures for evolution?
Right, so that would be the modernized version of intelligent design, that somewhere out there's a platonic ideal for these creatures and we're realizing them every so often. I'm just going to go to the simplest explanation, right, and use Occam's razor, that I'm not going to make believe that some programs exist somewhere, but I do see evidence of self-organization everywhere, in pretty much every aspect of life. So in theory, to me, self-organization is just as basic as gravity, right, although gravity is not well understood. Throw out gravity for a second. Electromagnetism, right, and so it's one of these natural processes of organization in the physical world that I think programs don't need to exist for, which is why it's such a basic driving force in biology. If we can create optimal mechanisms like converting sunlight into energy using chlorophyll that work on a quantum level as far as we can tell, then biology will select those solutions from the ones that are less efficient and less I guess, prominent for the animals that are getting them.
Yes, I wanted to know, when you say self-organization, so let's say there is one organism here that's self-organizing and another one here that's self-organizing. Then if you take it to a next level by the same token, are those two together also self-organizing so that eventually the whole universe is self-organizing? And
the claim is that all galaxies and flocks of birds and are in fact self-organizing. When you look at the average termite mound, it is perfectly created to disperse energy, to receive sunlight and disperse sunlight when it's necessary to happen.
Okay.
Now, all those creatures are by themselves self-organized in their cells, in their brains, and then that produces just levels of self-organization.
Right.
As far as we can tell, galaxy formation is a self-organizing process, so the universe is probably self-organized.
Right, okay, so simplistically we can say that there's self-organization at the micro level and then at the complete universal macro level. So although there may not be a God who designed it, but the whole universe is self-coordinated itself into a usable, practical design.
And that's basically where I'm going with that. Yep.
do you mean by self-organization that there is predetermination
No,
of emergent properties?
No, it's exactly that there is no predetermination
Okay.
of emergent properties. There's long-range correlations within the signal, such that small parts of the signal look like larger parts of the signal, but it's definitely not predetermined.
The previous speaker stole my thunder. I was going to ask, the idea of emergent properties has made its way into conventional science for the last 10, 15 years.
Right.
And it's very strong. I was wondering how you would compare your take on self-organizing to emergent properties.
I believe the average person that studies self-organization and dynamic systems would claim that the order that is seen as a result of self-organization is in fact an emergent property. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank Igor one more time.
Great. Thank you very much.